So welcome to a new episode of On the Musical Road to Emmaus. As you know, during Advent, I have been interviewing some clergy that I know to talk to them about their favorite Advent hymns and a little bit about what they're doing and what Advent means to them. Today, I'm really happy to be introducing you, or reintroducing some of you, to Father Allen Hoffa. Welcome, Father Hoffa.
Thank you so much for having me.
You are welcome. I'm thrilled that you're here. I know of you primarily from your having previously been a chaplain at Central Catholic High School while
That's
my
right.
son was there. And so I know you've moved on from Central Catholic, but of course you're still serving the diocese. Would you mind telling us what you are doing right now?
How long do we have to be able to talk about that? So currently, so I'm 16 years ordained a priest here in the Diocese of Allentown. I was ordained in 2009 and have been blessed to serve in a number of different capacities. I loved the 7 years that I spent at Allentown Central Catholic High School. It was a wonderful, wonderful time, and I will always look back on that time in my priesthood fondly. But currently, I serve as the pastor of Holy Guardian Angels Parish in Reading. And then in the diocese, I am the diocesan director of pilgrimages. And I'm also the chair of the Diocesan Lumen Christi Commission. And
I don't know what that means.
Yeah, so our Lumen Christi Commission is actually our diocesan response to the evil and issue of pornography that's out there in the world. I also work for an international Catholic apostolate called Integrity Restored, which addresses the same issue. And one of the reasons why I chose this song and why it has such a deep place in my heart, and it's amazing how these things connect. I've always loved Lo, How a Rose Are Blooming, but in the work that I do with Integrity Restored, we partner with a ministry called You Are Made New, and also Hope's Garden. And basically what we do through that is we bring healing to the lives of women who have been harmed by their husband's use of pornography and other things of sexual assault nature, etc., to be able to bring healing to them. And one of the ways that we do that is introducing them to Jesus as the bridegroom. And so we teach them about how Jesus is the perfect gentleman, and as the bridegroom, because we hear in the theology of the church that husbands are called to love their wives as Christ loves the church. And so for the women, they're referred to as roses, and they are the roses of the bridegroom. And it's a beautiful revelation of Hope's Garden's founder, Laura Ercolino, who is a dear friend and who I've had the blessing of working with. But when you ask me about a song, it's something that sort of has unfolded that I always love the beautiful hymn. And a lot of times in hymnals, it will have Lo, How a Rose Are Blooming positioned in the Christmas hymns, but it's actually a perfect hymn for Advent. So when you said about Advent, I thought, nope, Lo, How a Rose Are Blooming, and just the ability to reflect upon the song a little bit more, the hymn, that whole connection to Mary and that beautiful relationship between Jesus and Mary, but also then just the mention of the rose and the rose I have in mind. And I just sort of, in a way, I dedicate this conversation, this podcast, on my own part to the beautiful healing work that we've been able to do for those women, and that more women will be able to continue to see their own value as beloved roses of Jesus, and that they will see him as the bridegroom, as that model of just true masculinity, and that complementarity in relationship that is offered to women in a relationship with Jesus Christ.
Wow, that is such important work and so powerful. I really had no idea that existed. And thank you so much for sharing that mission. It is mission work. And so thank you for that. But also, I appreciate you've already jumped into what is the hymn that you've chosen. So there's a connection for you. You like the music, you like the hymn, but then there's also a connection for this particular part of your work as part of the body of Christ.
Amen. Exactly. Beautiful.
So you mentioned, you've already touched on one of the things that I wanted to talk about, and I think this was in my message to you, that it is often positioned in the Christmas parts of the hymnals. We have so little time in Advent anyway, right? I always I always hate when the fourth Sunday of Advent is Christmas Eve.
Yeah,
A colleague of mine
I'm
has
with you.
said it kind of feels cheated, like we lost part of Advent.
I agree.
And then for musicians and for the clergy, it's like super difficult because you have all of your regular Sunday services, and then boom, you barely get a chance to eat a meal, and you're right back for Christmas Eve services. But we can't have this hymn without the Virgin Mary. And
Amen.
we can't have Advent or Christmas without the Virgin Mary. So I can see why it's kind of positioned at the crux of those two seasons. And I think it's very hard to disentangle Advent from Christmas anyway. I think it's easier if we think about the other penitential season of Lent. We can much more easily disentangle that from the resurrection celebration.
Right.
But I think Advent and Christmas, it's not liturgically one and the same, but it almost feels that way because we're always prepping for Christmas and it's so short. It's like in a blink of an eye, it's gone.
Absolutely, 100%. And again, even just the way in which the music is set to the lyrics is there's just such a calming effect. And I think a lot of times people do not talk about the chaos, the chaotic nature that people feel during Lent leading into Easter. But what they do talk about is the chaotic feeling that they experience from Advent leading into Christmas, just because of all the hustle and bustle that's going on between parties and gift shopping and so on and so forth. So I think that what Advent calls us to is so counter to what the world is experiencing in that way, and it leads us to have a much better appreciation for the Christmas season. I always tell people, the worst thing that we can do is go and throw at our Christmas trees on the December 26th, because we're just starting the Christmas season. And when we are able to experience Advent and Christmas in their fullness, then it becomes a really life-giving experience versus Christmas is a day, and by the way, there was this lead up where we were doing all these things and it was sort of Christmas but it wasn't, and now it's done on the 26th. And that's really something that robs us of what the Advent and Christmas season combined can give to us. A lot of people used to have that tradition that their Christmas tree went up on the 24th, and then they celebrated. But, when people go and pitch all their Christmas trees and stuff like that on the 26th of December for the day after Christmas, and they're like, oh, Christmas is over. It's like, no, it's just starting.
I mean, as someone who selects the music at church, we sing Christmas music really up until the baptism of Christ. That's the point when we first actually kind of greet him as an adult. And everything else really is around the Christ child.
True story.
I love the way that you connected this hymn to the mission work that you're doing right now. But I'm wondering if you could go back a little bit and tell me, has this been a favorite of yours even before this most recent mission work? I mean, was this just always one of your favorite Advent hymns, and if so, why?
Before this work, yes, it was a part of my life. And I would say that, when I was growing up and stuff, if you had asked me when I was in middle school, high school, name me an Advent hymn, I'm going to hit you with O Come, Emmanuel. Then when I went to college and played football and was an education major for my freshman year, then I entered into the seminary for my sophomore year. And you go there and you see a much more vast birth of the church and all of these different things. And one of the things that I will say is that the talented musicians, soloists who were present when I was in the seminary, that was among the other seminarians, along with then the priests and laypersons who were in charge of the music department in the seminary. You just got such an education of just the vastness of what is there. It's great to hear what you're doing with this podcast, because I think sometimes, so often, people can relegate their music that they do in church to the last 50 years of church music. And there's such a beautiful prayer component and diversity over the centuries that we can really go back and look at and appreciate all of that as a means to draw us into closer relationship with Christ. So when I went to the seminary during Advent, this would be a hymn that we would use often. It was, I believe it's in the breviary, which is the prayer books that we pray. I think, again, it was that that sense of calm,
Yeah.
when it just comes out, and like, I just feel this beautiful sense of calm. And I think, again, the connection to our Blessed Mother in this, she is that mother who wants calm for us, her children. She doesn't want us to be in that anxiety. She doesn't want us to be in that angst. I would have said, O come, Emmanuel, would be my Advent hymn prior to that. But we're looking forward in hopeful anticipation of Emmanuel coming. But at the same time, for different people, expectation and anticipation, which are two different things, can cause different feelings and emotions in a person. And sometimes it can cause anxiety. And, well, what's going to happen? When are they going to come? When is it going to be? And it's that calm that we sometimes need, of almost like a thinking of an anxious child being calmed by their mother, that Mary does that for us, and to have that peace. And I love the other thing too, in the parish right now, we're doing a program through Ascension Press that's called Fulfilled. And it's with this wonderful woman, Sonia Corbett. And it's all based on, she was a really faithful Baptist in the South, and she converted to the Catholic Church. And she talks about how the Old Testament is fulfilled in the New Testament. And she makes all of these connections, with the priest and the sanctuary and the altar and all these things, from God's chosen people in the Old Testament into the Catholic Church. And, in that, there is a real beauty of making those connections, because in this, we're looking forward to connecting with Christ, but we're going back to Isaiah. And we're looking at what Isaiah said in the Old Testament, and now the fulfillment is coming to fruition in the New Testament. And what a blessing that is.
This is one of the few hymns that I can think of in Christmas or Advent that actually makes a specific reference to the Old Testament. It says, Isaiah 'twas foretold it. It actually reminds us of that prophecy of Isaiah.
Correct. We have the cycle of readings in the church, and when we really have the cycle that is heavy with Isaiah, those messianic prophecies, it really is to say that, God has a plan. And I think that that's one of the things that it draws us back to, is that God is God and we are not. And he has this plan, and this, if we participate in it, within it, we're going to find our greatest joy. And so all through Isaiah, the prophet, he's bringing to light, people's looking forward and hopeful expectation of this Messiah. And so this beautiful reflection of it sort of coming to fruition in this just beautiful blooming of the Blessed Mother is it's beautiful.
Yeah, I love using this hymn. The fourth Sunday of Advent, always a strong Marian message there, if I recall correctly.
Yes, the Marian message as we get through. So again, a lot of times people don't realize, and we talk about this, that Advent has two parts to it. The first part of Advent is focused on that time where we're going to come to meet Christ in, at the end of our life and in his second coming. And then the second part of Advent is actually that more proximate preparation for Christmas and the celebration of Christmas anew in our hearts. But when we go back to it and we see the mass readings for that fourth Sunday of Advent, again goes to Isaiah chapter 7. And then we go through and we hear from Matthew 1 and then verses 28 to 24, which is connected to that preparation or that moment of Jesus's birth, and everything there. The 17th onward is that focus on Christmas, and just those little pieces of anticipation and the lead up to the moment when the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. So Mary, of course, is a huge central figure in all of that as we walk that journey.
From the 17th onward, this actually goes back, I think, to the other piece that you have referenced, which is O come, Emmanuel. I know that O come, Emmanuel, Veni, Veni, Emmanuel dates back to the 13th century as a Gregorian chant. And
Correct.
It was only set much later with organ, but it's still very modal. Lo How Arose comes from the very end of the 16th century, and it has a very different feel because we were writing music differently at that point, and we have chords and whatnot. As I recall, in one hymnal that I used to see, I think it was the Old People's Mass book, we were supposed to do different verses every day, every last 7 days leading up to Christmas. I think it was the O antiphons. Do I have that correct?
That is correct. Yes, the O antiphons are part of that lead up to Christmas. And it is within that last section of the 7 days, from the 17th to the 24th. So when you look at, when you start on the 17th, it is O Wisdom. And then the 18th is O Sacred Lord, O Adonai. And then the 19th is O Flower of Jesse's Stem. The 20th is O Key of David. The 21st is O Radiant Dawn. The 22nd is O King of all the nations. The 23rd is O Emmanuel. And then that takes us into the 24th and the celebration of Christmas.
Yeah, so there's a parallel there. That is leading into that second part of Advent. It's a huge part of that second part of Advent, as you have described.
Yeah, and I love the fact that you're doing this, because I think so often, like, people just think of these church hymns as, oh, it's just a hymn, it's just something that we sing at mass or service or whatever it is, and that's a part of it. But again, music it's prayer, but also there's something that is so much deeper. It's teaching. There's theology in that. And I think that that's where some place where the church does do a good job of, it calls those who are, in your position as a music director and in the selection of music, to go deeper into the theology and also make sure that the music is theologically correct and that it is bringing people into that deeper sense. So like you said, with the old PMB, when they would have use these particular verses for these different days, it's to take people down or take people to another aspect of what our church teaching is within these liturgical seasons.
That's what this is about for me. I'm engaging in some spiritual growth myself, sharing what I know and what I sort of intuit, but also being able to engage with people who have actually studied this and be able to share that. So first of all, Advent is so short. To introduce a new Advent hymn is really, really hard. You need a couple of weeks to introduce it, and then a couple of weeks, where during ordinary time, we might sing a new hymn 2 weeks in a row, give it a break, throw it in there for the fourth week, give it a break, and so that the congregation has a chance to know it. We don't really have that chance in Advent. And so we fall back, I think, very often on O Come, Emmanuel, Lo, how a rose, and on Jordan's bank. I always feel a little uncomfortable, I will admit, putting O Come, Emmanuel out there the first week of Advent, because I do remember that thing about the O antiphons. And so for me, it feels like it should be later, but I think most people expect it to be there throughout Advent.
Correct. You're exactly right. And so a lot of places, they will save it towards the latter part of Advent and then do, other things that are even just connected to those thematic aspects of each of the other first week, the first, second, and even sometimes the third weekend, depending on when it falls in connection to Christmas. So, but it is hard. And sometimes, you just have to know that, hey, people are going to hear this again next year. So we'll try it twice this year and bring it up again next year, and they'll get there eventually. But there is something to be said for what that deeper theological underpinning is of those hymns, to be able to draw people into that proper part of the liturgical season, even again the 2 parts of Advent that we're going through right now.
I have a couple of final questions for you, if you don't mind. So first of all,
course.
if you encountered someone who was really struggling to enter into Advent, how do you think this particular hymn might help them? And I'm going back to Lo, how a rose, not to O Come, Emmanuel.
Correct. Yeah, I think the one thing is, peace. Because a lot of times when I just actually preached on this past weekend in connection to the different things that I do in my work, how often I encounter people who have lost their peace. They are without peace in their life. And I would say that, the ability to reclaim that peace is so essential. And we can choose that. So one, reclaiming that peace is an opportunity to be in calm. But also, if we think of, like, for instance, the 7 sorrows of Mary, she who went through sorrows was still at peace. And she becomes a beautiful model for us. And the other thing that can bring us peace is knowing that God's in charge and that we don't have to be. And when you hear about, like, for instance, Isaiah, we were talking about the messianic prophecies of Isaiah, to be able to know that, his plan is already at work. And it was at work in the Immaculate Conception. It was at work in the Annunciation. It was at work in the Nativity, and all of this was working in with what God was doing within His plan. There's something to be said when I don't have to be in charge anymore. Like I look at, I wait for those moments, and I'm sure that you do in your leadership position as well. When someone comes to you and says, "I got this," oh, thanks be to God. I just have to sit back and I can just enjoy, or someone else is going to do all the laborious aspects of this task. Thank you. I'm very happy to allow you to do that.
Yeah.
So I think that, for a person who is feeling that sort of angst or that chaos in the season, this is something that just delving deeper into the lyrics and into the musical setting of Lo, How a Rose Are Blooming can bring that beautiful peace to that person in their life.
Yeah. And Mary is not only a fantastic role model, but I mean, I'm just in awe that at age 13 or 14, whatever she was, that she could just be like, "Okay, God, whatever you want."
Yeah, and again, that's a beautiful credit to her parents, Joachim and Anne.
Yes,
and just how she was raised to be in that place of just beautifully accepting of what God wanted to do, and knowing that what He was going to do was for her good and also for the good of all creation.
Yes. Normally, I would start with this question, and you kind of touched on this, but I want to ask: when you hear the word Advent in any context, what is the first thing that comes to mind?
Waiting. Waiting. I just think that I love this. So within, our Catholic rite, sometimes we adapt things to make people feel welcomed or included, but our theology is actually very appropriate in what it teaches. And I make reference to the moment of reception of Holy Communion. When a person comes up to receive Holy Communion, that moment is for those who are properly disposed, are in the state of grace. And what we have sometimes adapted in the church is that for those who are not, for those who come up and cross their arms, for little children, they receive a blessing.
Right.
And it's always a cute moment when you have, and this happened a few times recently, where there's little children, and I want that.
Yes.
And I tell parents, I said, that is a moment of beautiful teaching to be able to instill in your child Eucharistic desire, a desire for the Eucharist, and talk them up to the point of receiving their first Holy Communion when they're about 7 years old in second grade, and really just let that ruminate in them and let that desire just well up in them. And I think that there is something to be said for waiting, especially in a world where it seems like we can get everything in an instant.
Yeah.
And Advent teaches us that there is a good in waiting, because there is good things that happen during the waiting.
Yeah.
And I think that is something that is that is good, that our faith brings us to that waiting and that desire for what is to come to completion at the end of the time of waiting. So Advent brings us to, again, in that first part, our waiting to meet the Lord in heaven, and also are waiting to meet the Lord at Christmas.
Well, and when you put that story together with one of our newest saints, Carlo Acutis, and you've got a great narrative there for those parents.
100%. Carlos, my guy. He actually, in my ministry, we look to him as the one, as our intercessor who's going to bring an end to internet pornography. He used the internet for good things. He was normal young man, played soccer, loved his video games, all that kind of stuff. But he also loved the Eucharist. And he used the internet to be able to educate people on the Eucharistic miracles. Like, yes, use it for its proper purpose, and it can be something that makes a huge impact on people's lives.
Yeah. Father, is there any last thoughts you want to share?
No, I just want to thank you for doing this and for the opportunity to talk about it. For one of my, favorite Advent hymns, I know sometimes, people can make assumptions and get, especially our doctrine as Catholic Church on the Blessed Virgin Mary wrong. But, we don't worship her, but we do give her proper praise for who she is and the fact that she is always leading us to Christ.
Right.
And so, in that waiting and in that anticipation of encountering Christ in one's life, at the end of one's life in heaven, at Christmas, go to Mary. because you're never going to go wrong. She is a protective mother. She cares for us, and she's always going to take us to her son, who she loved and who she carried in her womb for 9 months and who she raised to be an incredible man who died for all of us. And through our willingness to give ourselves over to the maternal direction of Mary, we too can be led to quite amazing things that we never even thought were possible. But because she helped us to go there, it became very possible through God's grace.
Yes. Well, thank you so much for that final thought. And honestly, I have really enjoyed this conversation, and I learned a lot from what you shared, more than I thought I would. I knew that every conversation that I have with one of our priests always enlightens me about something, but this was really terrific. I hope that you all learned something from Father Hoffa and enjoyed this podcast, and I wish everyone a happy remainder of Advent and a very merry and healthy Christmas. This is Carol Traupman-Carr, your host, signing off on another musical road to Emmaus.